This is a Dalarna University production.
Well, good morning. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to come to a part of Sweden I've never been to before and to be present at this very interesting event. And thank you very much for being here, what to an English person is a very early hour of the morning to be starting proceedings, so I'm very grateful for your resilience. I notice this is my talk, and I guess I'll talk for about 45 minutes. I notice quite a lot of you have got digital devices active in front of you, and so I thought I'd take advantage of that and try and generate a little bit of extra interactivity than that which we normally enjoy on these kind of occasions. So I'm going to start this talk by making an invitation to you to that effect. And when you've read that last email and finally tweaked your Facebook status and are looking for something else to do, then can I invite you to go to the URL at the bottom of this screen where you will go to a site where anyone with a digital device and internet access can share. And then, if you have any comments or objections or questions or critiques, then there's a chance to share them with your colleagues and to make them visible to me at the end, maybe. It's very easy to do. All you need to know is your name, and you would type that into the little blue box. That's my name, so don't put that name in. It'll be very confusing. But put your own name in and then type, I think it says join. And this will clear the box and put you in a position to not say something, actually, but to type something. And then you do that, and I've done a little sample. And then you hit the word say, and it goes into what will be an evolving list of little comments. As you see, they're date stamped, and this one reveals how close to the last minute I prepare my slides. But you'll see then a unfolding list of comments. And I think it's probably a good thing to do because I may say a couple of things that are slightly irritating to the spirit of this conference, and so maybe it'll be therapeutic for you to be able to air your reactions to that. Now, I've also recruited a colleague, Russell, are you here? Okay, Russell at the back there is going to deal with the possibility that it's nothing but terrorist abuse, and so he will pull out of this list any pressing challenges or questions at the end if it's not obvious what they are, and maybe make them public. So let's see if that works, and I hope that's in the spirit of this event. The irritating things I might say, I think, fall into two categories. One is that I'm conscious this is a community that is very engaged with distance learning and e-learning, online learning, initiatives of that kind. And I would say at the outset that I'm very enthusiastic about developments in that area. I've had a long personal association with the Open University in Britain, which Terry mentioned yesterday, and so I think this is a very worthwhile and worthy form of educational practice. But actually, the talk I want to give is more about traditional residential undergraduate experience, and it's really about, kind of in a sense, protecting something about that experience that might need our vigilance. Now, I must stress I'm not talking about some romantic kind of ivory tower conception of what residential universities might offer, but I think they do offer something that's quite precious. And maybe it's interesting to reflect on the fact that most kids, when they leave school, are not particularly engaged by the opportunity to do an online degree. It's a very rare appetite to find in school leavers, but they are, even in my country where fees for doing so have risen from £0 to £9,000 a year, they're still very anxious to take advantage of that 3-year experience that defines the residential undergraduate life. And I think that's not too surprising, and we have to notice that it does involve something more than an academic curriculum. My own son has just started at Manchester University, and I think at the end of his first year he's intellectually matured enormously, but not particularly because of the history he's been studying. I think it's kind of living in a multicultural house. It's working on the student newspaper, it's taking part in live conversations, it's working to deadlines. It's a whole package of experiences that includes an academic curriculum, but is still very precious to many young people. So I think it's something we do need to continue to be attentive to at the same time as we resource and cultivate alternative modes of flexible learning. So that's one thing I want to dwell on, that kind of experience. And secondly, I'd like to query some of the ways in which new technology is reconfiguring that experience, and not maybe assume that it's always in the best interests of what it is we do want to protect. So I think there are some tensions surrounding the application of digital technologies in this arena, and so if there's irritation there, it will be perhaps me seeming to question some of that enthusiasm. And I'm reminded, therefore, of the fact that I come from a part of England that was at one point in the Victorian era very much occupied by the Luddites, and is possibly the only known representation of Ned Ludd, who, as some of you may know, was not particularly enthusiastic about new Victorian technologies and somewhat critical about them. And here are the Luddites being critical about technology. I don't wish to frame myself as trying to do that. And if I identify tensions, I think I will try and identify, where I can in some places anyway, solutions that come from technology as well as potential problems that they create for us. Okay. Let's start the talk proper. And in the back of my thinking here is something which in popular social science discourse is sometimes called the social turn. That's to say a reorientation towards educational practice that foregrounds the role of the social in our experience. And it's the social quality of learning that I want to dwell on. Here's a little way of expressing that in terms of two very distinguished figures within the history of our thinking about learning and development. And I've taken Piaget to represent a kind of constructivist tradition which maybe puts a lot of emphasis on the autonomous, independent, self-regulating, constructing learner. And I'm suggesting that the visibility of that notion as a totalized, singular notion is in some decline. Whereas with the emergence of Vygotsky, interesting, these two people kind of writing and developing ideas at about the same time, but a sort of star-like rise. But where do these claims about visibility come from? I don't know whether this is credible or not, but one rainy afternoon, I did a little sort of research analytics on the abstracts of papers within psychology, and searched for the word Piaget, and searched for the word Vygotsky year on year, and that's what you get when you do that. So you get a sort of sense of something going into decline and something rising. Of course, you also get this little blip, but I think that just reflects the fact that after a while, people felt when they were writing sociocultural stuff that it was no longer necessary to keep talking about Vygotsky, really, and now we could talk with confidence about, in particular, the social turn. Well, I do get a bit frustrated with the way Vygotsky is appropriated into the discourse of educational practice. I mean, first of all, the social is the thing that seems most conspicuous to people, and then when you say, what is it about the social that's of special interest, it turns out to be collaborative learning, as if this is all one meant by some new emphasis on social experience. And I think it does mean more than that, and all the examples I give today are really about looking at social in a way that takes us beyond some simple notion of collaborative learning, at least in the classic sense of two or three people gathered around a resource and trying to build knowledge together. The other thing is, of course, sociocultural theory is very much about mediation. It's about inviting us to think about the circumstances, the tools, the conditions, the contexts in which communication takes place, communication with each other, and communication between ourselves and the world. So this is a mediated experience, and to understand its dynamic, we need to be well oriented to the mediating agents. And so I'm thinking about that and technology's role in mediating communication within contexts of teaching and learning. And of course, as I've just said, I'm especially interested in some of the tensions that I feel have arisen because of that particular mediation. Before giving you some examples, what I believe are tensions and some suggestions as to what might be remediations that are useful, I just wanted to identify two aspects of the current educational context that I think are worth noting. And this is a shamelessly UK perspective, although I think it's probably echoed elsewhere, but you can tell me otherwise. And the 2 points are to do with the reduction in staffing within higher education and also new attitudes about appropriate pedagogies. Take the staffing one first. Here's a bar chart that compares the number of students per member of staff in the blue bar in the secondary education sector in 1986 and in the red bar in the university sector. And of course there are less students per member of staff. And we're okay with that because we say, oh, university staff, they have to do all this administration and form filling and research. And so it's a polarized activity. So we're not too surprised to find that difference. But if we move forward 20 years, we find that difference has changed quite strikingly. Not in the secondary sector where staff-student ratios remain the same, but there are now twice as many students per member of staff in British universities than there were 20 years ago. And that's a curiously, it's a curious phenomenon. It feels like it's sort of sneaked up on you. And in some ways you're aware of it, but you're not quite sure when it happened or how it happened or what's going on, really. So this is a big impact on the social experience of being a student. But at the same time, and I think in an interesting kind of complementarity, so this is something that which is in a sense justified that change, there's been a fresh thinking about the pedagogies that are appropriate for undergraduates. And I'd like to present that to you in a slightly exotic way by appealing to a study I did a while ago about representations of learning. So we're asking here, in the public domain, when educational institutions are explicit about their idea about what kind of experience learning is, how do they present it? So we look at university prospectuses as a source of images that convey what learning is to be, particularly to intending students and their parents and generally the outside world. And these prospectuses, many of which are now online, are very rich in images, and the one on the left here has put them all over its cover, and indeed when you open the cover you will find very many. So we just look at the images that are associated with the academic departments and do a little content analysis of those. And I'm not going to present this in detail. There's much interesting semiotic work to be done on them, but I'm not going to do that. I'll just make a general point. This is actually from my own university's perspectives of about the period we were just talking about, and it's very much, well, it's black and white photos of clearly real people, and they're evidently enjoying quite an intimate kind of social relationship. In one case, I think it says the small print, in a conversation about mechanics, and the other about human anatomy. If we move forward 20 years and look at images from a current perspective, they look far more like this. Actually, I think the guys on the left are probably agency models that somehow or other don't look convincing, but the ones on the right, I think, do look like honest students having an okay time rather than a great time, which they're having at the top. But in both cases, the emphasis has shifted towards a much more self-regulating, collaborative kind of experience of learning. And the prevailing theme when you make this contrast, it's also interesting to do it cross-culturally actually, but when you make this contrast across time, is that teachers have been airbrushed out of this world. So it's very unusual to see images of learning that involve a teacher. So there's been a change towards an enthusiasm for the idea that students will self-regulate in these collaborative structures. But again, I think that's not just what we mean by social. At least what's portrayed here is not just what we mean by social. And so I'd like to explore the kind of hidden crevices of the social within educational experience, and worry a little about how they've been reconfigured as maybe usefully hidden things. Well, technology is involved in that remediation quite a big way, I think. And in this slide, I'm just reminding ourselves that we are living under various kinds of imperatives to embrace new digital technologies and make them a significant part of the way we manage a student's experience. And I suggest there are at least these three imperatives that act upon us. I mean, one is a very worthy one, that it's very important and proper to be innovative. We should always be embracing new opportunities and new tools that make it a richer experience. And so I guess as a community, we orient towards this invitation very positively: let's be innovative. Secondly, there's a sort of promise of efficiency, I think. And indeed, in my view, the main impact of digital technology on higher education has been on processes, management processes, not on cognitive processes, if you like. And indeed, I'll give you an example of that in a minute. So there is a promise that this will make some of the boring things less visible to us, less required of us, and things will move more efficiently. But there's also, I think, something that's not so often identified, so I wanted to just to draw it out before going any further, which is what we call an accountability imperative. And that arises from, these things are obvious, but what's this one about? I think it arises from certainly something that British academics are very conscious of. And at a lunchtime conversation yesterday, I realized it was by no means a problem of ours, which is audit. And that growth of the audit culture is, I think, very well documented in these two books. If this is anything that interests you, Michael Power's Audit Explosion, and a collection of essays edited by the anthropologist Strathclyde on auditing processes in education, particularly higher education. What this is about, of course, is forms of accountability that have slowly taken a structure of high visibility. So really what counts as being accountable is being able to show a trail of your processes. And new technology is very powerful in its capacity to create these visible trails, which allow auditors to enter an institution and very quickly judge that work is being done well. You don't actually need to see anybody teaching or learning. What you see is a kind of digital paper trail of the fact that certain processes have gone on. So I think technology has allowed us to be very responsive to the demand of accountability in this sense. And it's also, of course, been very stressful for people and very distracting. But it's not really what I want to make the core of the story. What I want to go on and do is to pull out 5 examples. Some of them, I think, corresponding to what I'm calling this sort of hidden quality of the social, and notice some of the way remediation has changed their quality, and draw upon, in each case, 5 pieces of empirical work, which I haven't got time to open up in detail here, but I'm very happy to comment on if question time allows. So let's do these one by one, and start with the most familiar of teaching modalities within higher education, which is the set-piece lecture. Just maybe think about it for a moment as being potentially a social experience. It seems a bit odd to some people. I mean, it's clearly a monologue. It's and you're a victim of it at the moment. It's a species of uninterrupted speech. Well, back channels and so on that I've initiated are some kind of destabilizing of that, but we don't normally think of the social process. And yet, if it works because it invites within us as audience, in some kind of Bakhtinian way, a kind of private dialogue. So you're perfectly free to put aside your email and Facebook and enter into an argument with me, and to maybe have thoughts that are in some modest way, built upon a platform of exposition that the lecture creates. So it does have a social quality, I think. And of course, it does have, it does illustrate the most widely used digital technology, probably within all education, but certainly within higher education. And maybe you can write down now what the most widely used piece of, what you think the most widely used piece of educational technology is. And of course, the answer is what you're looking at now, which is PowerPoint. And so here's some observations from a study that my student Maddie Halliwell is doing at the moment, which is kind of about PowerPoint. At least it's about the integration of image and voice as it typically is managed within what lecturers do. That's quite a lot of work on the integration of image and text as we find it in conventional textbooks and as we find it in multimedia applications, and I think this is the work of Mayer and others. But less understanding, I think, of the way in which the visual image is integrated with speech. And Maddie's looked rather ingeniously, I think, taken a single topic that's very widely taught in first-year undergraduate. She's taken first-year undergraduate psychology and taken the area of developmental psychology. And if you have ever studied developmental psychology, you know that every course will contain a lecture on attachment theory. So she's gone to about 15 universities and listened to and captured the attachment theory lecture. And it's interesting, I mean, everybody's giving, in a sense, the same script, really. When you stand back from it, it's all about Harlow and Bowlby and monkeys in, you know that if you've done psychology, you'll know about it. But they're done in very different ways. And it really comes down to the skill with which the visual imagery is integrated with and weaved into what is being said. And often the student is in quite a predicament, I think, in terms of keeping their place within the narrative, in terms of the way this is managed. But that's not quite what I want to dwell on. What I think is also apparent when you look at the recordings of these lectures is the sense in which there's a sort of depersonalization that comes about through PowerPoint. Not in a room like this, which is delightfully well lit and welcoming, but in many lecture theatres, the room is cast into a kind of shadowy darkness, so that the actual speaker is not particularly visible. What the main thing is that you should be able to see these slides. And sometimes this depersonalization kind of occurs in a spatial sense. Now, I don't know if you can see, but way down here, this is one of the most distinguished international developmental psychologists. You know, some of you may recognize him. He's president of the Jean Piaget Society and so on and so on. Here he is, dwarfed by his PowerPoint, barely visible within the lecture theatre. A very good lecture, actually, but a sort of depersonalization that comes about through the spatial arrangement of experience in these places. And then there's a kind of cognitive depersonalization that I think we're familiar with, and it really comes down to the way in which this technology deflects attention from the voice onto the kind of bullet point lists that accompany these presentations. And so, in a way, attention, the thing that matters is the thing that's being projected on the screen. Those are the things on which student notes are built, and that's the knowledge, really. So there is taking out of the situation the presence of the present. Now, you could, it doesn't have to be this way, and my exploration of alternatives, I admit, are limited in terms of what's realistic, although I do think projection technologies are changing in a way that would allow what I'll show you next to be more straightforward. And if anyone here knows an industry contact in the projection world, I'd be very pleased to talk to them about my brilliant research project around this topic. But anyway, here's a room in my university which admittedly is a small room, although it takes about 50 people if you're doing presentations. And the point is to think about, it's darkened for the purpose of this photograph, but to think about multiple projection as a presentational device. And if you think about the normal lecture, really, the lecturer stands still like I'm doing now. I mean, I'm a classic demonstration of a problem I'm trying to precipitate out here. So the lecturer stays still and the slides move. In this situation, the slide stays still and the lecturer moves. So It's a presentation on fine art, which has always been a tradition of teaching, always been a domain where being able to make simultaneous contrasts and comparisons is very important. So you're able to move amongst these images and force comparisons and make juxtapositions and so on, and treat the use of the image as something that's less about the unfolding of some kind of inevitable linear narrative, and instead something that's about a certain kind of motion amongst ideas. I think that's a very interesting departure from it. And the point is that it brings back into view the social quality of the experience, in the sense of it being one person exploring a perspective on some material and inviting you in some dialogic way to challenge it. So I think the lecture we need to see as a social experience, and we need to see it being remediated by technology in ways that maybe, I'm not saying they're always unwelcome, but they're not the only way to think about the experience. Well, here's a second example based upon the demand on us to manage assessment. And I think we should think about assessment also as a form of social relationship. I mean, it's a very momentary, episodic relationship, although, as it evolves over time, hopefully it becomes something richer than that, depending on the way things are organized with students and tutors and so on. But let's think about an individual occasion of assessment and the way in which that's altered under the influence of new forms of mediation. This is a study I did with Harriet Gross some time ago, based upon one university's departments. Well, it wasn't based on one university, it's actually based on polling a number of university departments and confirming that the processes used were broadly the same, but then looking very closely at one community's execution of those processes. And the part I want to highlight is the part where feedback is delivered to the student. And although it might sometimes be a summative assessment, nevertheless it often comes with feedback. And so students have an expectation that their work will solicit a reaction, and tutors have an understanding that they have a responsibility to be the architects of that reaction. But what's happened under the influence of technology, I think, is a proceduralization of this responsibility. So this is actually a paper version because it's somewhat old, but I mean now all these things are actually online versions in which there's an awful lot of administrative stuff in the top half that has to be done, and there's a little tiny bit at the bottom where you make your reactions to the students' work, and even that is kind of structured, so there's good points, weak points, advice. And so the responsibility for this role is deflected into this interesting artifact. Now, I'm saying this is a kind of digitization of a relationship, and in the romantic world of higher education, feedback would have been executed perhaps in a more negotiated way, perhaps in some kind of dialogic way, but it'd certainly be something that was more personal. And if you look at the process of assessment management, well, it involves two agents, a student who's the author of something and a tutor who's the reader of something. It has at least these steps that take you through the point from assigning a task to composing, to accepting it, reading it, commenting on it, so on, and then the student maybe finally reflecting on it. And all these elements within the process are mediated by others and sometimes by various kinds of digital artifacts. And then when we talk to students about it, the experience of this process, they're somewhat uneasy about it, and you see some quotes here that came out of various focus group conversations in which students are expressing that unease. So someone's marking their work, they don't know who you are, and there's this sense of being decoupled from the reader of your work. And an interesting quote here from someone reflecting on their experience of being at school, because maybe these students were in their first year of university and they're looking back to remember those ratios, we're looking back to a form of encounter with their teachers which was far more intimate, and they'd often talk about teachers kind of looking over their shoulder at the work and adding some comments and certainly remembering that you'd written it and certainly remember reading it and so on. Then you're thrown into this strange world of higher education where you never even meet the person who's reading your work, and I think this kind of alienation of roles is often felt as being very uncomfortable. So the notion, if we think about sort of author and reader rather than student and teacher, there's what I feel is an unhealthy decoupling of those roles and responsibilities that is violating what would otherwise be a social relationship. And I think it's rendered uncomfortable by technology. Now, there are ways to do it differently. Some of them are a bit more labor intensive. And I just develop on a way that Terry mentioned yesterday when he talked about audio annotation. I do that, not always, I do that quite a lot though, but you can do a version of it that's basically video audio or audio video annotation. You've only got to use something like Jing or one of these free screencasting devices, and this is a piece of work that's also been marked up at the same time. You needn't do that, but then you start your screen recorder and just scan through the piece of work and you make an auditory comment on what's been done. And students find this very welcoming, really. I mean, it's still not the level of personal contact that I'm talking about here, but nevertheless, it brings the reader into the space of authorship in a way that I think is very healthy and does recapture something of the social quality of the experience. So technologies don't have to force us into these uncomfortable forms of sociality. They can also restructure them in what might be quite interesting and productive ways. Okay, here's a third example. The curriculum itself is traditionally encountered, I suppose, in reading lists and library resources and other ways of handbooks that we specify what it is to be learned, what the in the modern language of auditing, what the learning outcomes should be. But now I think there's an interesting shift in the way in which teachers are invited to represent the curriculum, and it comes about because of our engagement with learning platforms or virtual learning environments or learning management systems or whatever you call them. And I think what's interesting about them, well, one of the things that's interesting about them is that they create a new kind of role for university teachers, which is a bit more like conventional authoring rather than what we're very used to doing, which is verbal exposition. So now we are actually given tools and given a platform on which it's possible to kind of write ones and illustrate the core curriculum of some course. So here you see just an example of this to the point I'm trying to make. This is a course on, I don't know, structural analysis, something or other. So it's one of many such module homepages that Bob Cluley and me looked at a couple of years ago in a representative institutional VLE. We looked at thousands of these. And the reason we were looking at them was to try and draw out those examples where some kind of sociality was being manifest in the articulation of the curriculum. So we were looking at them as social spaces. How do you, as an author of this material, if you choose to use the medium to take the role of an author more aggressively, how do you put your voice into those materials? Or do you put your voice into those materials? And we found about a tiny percentage, not tiny, a small percentage of these sites where people had taken the opportunity to be something more like authors, and this one shows the kind of thing I mean, where it's been designed and the text has been composed by a teacher for presentation to students during the course. And some lecturers go about this with great enthusiasm. But when you ask, to what extent within those examples do we find a kind of expression of the social, a kind of sense of the author's voice and a sense of relationship with the student? It's pretty thin, actually, and this pulled out in this sort of summary table in terms of different ways in which you can be expressive, or you can personalize the experience, or you can show signs of empathy in some way with the student. And so the point of our study, I think, was to draw attention to a kind of impersonal quality that this arena of authoring seems to throw up. And it needn't be that way. I mean, it could, and indeed within the sample, I think we found just one example of where, in looking at it, you felt this is a really nice guy. He was a guy as well. This is a really nice guy, and I'd really like to be taught by this person. And there is a sense of, in their voice, you can hear an enthusiasm for what they're doing and an empathy with the people to whom they're talking. But this is very unusual. So it's not impossible. And when you look closely at it, the genre of writing that it represents is certainly quite accessible, but it's not something one expects to find. Let's move to two examples that are much more traditional in terms of the way they represent the social, in that they're more about the social as a form of traditional collaboration and collaboration amongst peers. Let me describe a study that I published some years ago, which, as far as I can tell, no one's ever read. But you know, it's a pity, because I thought it was one of the best little empirical studies I'd done, and yet, well, there you are. That's the way it goes. You can explain to me why it's actually off the rails, I don't know. But the basic idea was to look at the issue of resourcing collaboration and think about collaborative conversations as always being resourced. I mean, they are always organized around some form of mediation or opportunity, and often technologies, whether they be print technologies or digital technology, screen technologies, will be entering as resources within that role. So what we did was to take actually three groups, but for purposes today, two groups of students working in pairs in preparation for a sudden death examination, which they were about to take in the subject, revising the material that had been presented in a lecture course across that semester. And they were invited to several revision sessions where they would work together from their own lecture notes. And another group were invited to work together from the lecturers' very generously provided kind of hypertext online notes. So lecturer had sort of turned their presentational notes into a hypertext document and made them available on the network for students to work from. And so we're looking at the quality of conversation that is mediated by these two forms of representation of the same underlying material. These people were present at the time, and they made some, no, wrong way around. These people are working from the lecture, and these people were present at the time also, but they're working from their own notes. And so we compare them in relation to a number of measures. And so these are the students working from their own notes, and these are the students in two groups. It doesn't matter, it's not important for this point, working from the... And these things down here are, not all of them you'd say are irrelevant, but they're kind of off-task talk. And these things here are the things you want to happen. These are the elaborated discourse of revision and review. And because the point I'm trying to make here is that if you compare these with these, you find they're significantly different, and what this seems to suggest is that if you're working from your own records of the occasion, the quality of the conversation, the elaborative nature of the exploration of that occasion is much richer. And it's as if really in looking at these guys, they're kind of deferring to the official version of what was said. And in these guys, they are really negotiating an understanding of separate interpretations of what was said, and within that they're finding quite a rich kind of opportunity to explore the underlying material. So the point really is not to kind of rubbish the enterprise that creates these things. That's probably an important place for such resources, but not to suppose that it's better for sure because it's official, as it were, and to recognize that those forms of representations of some body of ideas that's taking place in a lecture course will have similar impacts, and in this case they don't. Let's look at this final example. This is not really about technology, it's about something more general to do with the material design of the environments we create for students to be students in. So I'm thinking of kind of about the ecology of the social life of being a student at a residential university. Increasingly, universities are investing in spaces of this kind, which are called sometimes new learning spaces. Actually, they're often new places of oppression where you sit in cramped rooms getting hot looking at screens. So they're not always designed in a way that is very welcoming. But there's a great deal of enthusiasm for exploring the ecology of learning in this sense. And indeed, in Britain, the former government created a £50 billion scheme called Building Schools for the Future, which was based around the idea that this mattered, that you really needed to invest in the physical, material, spatial conditions of study. The government changed and the scheme was scrapped, but there are many interesting stories around it. It continues within universities, which are perhaps incubators for exploring these possibilities. So very commonly, they take place in libraries. So here you have a pleasant-looking library which has been spoilt by these things parachuting into them and creating kind of study pods, taking up vast amounts of space in return for very little kind of mobility. And students may or may not like them. There's a version of this that's, I think, more convivial and more commonplace, which kind of looks like this. And this is one taken from my own university library, in which me and Gemma Mitchell did a study recently trying to identify the kind of things that students did in these places and the kind of experience they felt they were having from using them as opportunities to privately study. Now, the philosophy behind these kind of designs is, of course, one which is of informality, one which encourages students to work together, and one which aspires towards creating the conditions of collaborative learning. So we went into this space, and Gemma spent a lot of time doing a kind of ethology of what went on. That's to say, observing student behavior from a distance and content analyzing it in various ways. She did what we called kind of guerrilla conversations, where you just go up to people and say, what are you doing? And why are you doing it? And she's got a much better manner than me, so she was very good at doing this, and they always seem to be happy to want to take part in these conversations. We did focus groups where we invited people in exchange for lunch and vouchers to come and talk to us about their experience that day and in general. And then we gave some students audio recorders to keep an audio diary over a week of all the places they did their study in, and think about this as, or other places of informality against which that investment was set. So really what we're thinking about is this kind of migration from private study as being this kind of romantic thing over here towards something more like this. And I think underneath there's this implicit model that what we're trying to do is to borrow a kind of experience that people feel comfortable with, and it's important to allow us, and import it into this environment of private, deliberate, intentional learning. And it's the dynamic of this borrowing that we got interested in. And so how do you do that? We're interested in thinking about, it's very difficult to present this kind of studies, a lot of qualitative material in it, so I hope this works. So what I'm going to do is to create these 4 spaces on the screen, where I'm thinking on the one hand about aspects of what we call the open world, because I'm comparing this with the open study space or open library, aspects of the open world that are give within us a kind of comfortable disposition. We like to be there. The activities that go on there we feel comfortable with and happy to engage with, and recognizing at the same time that the social world is also a place of friction and tension and difficulty. So it's not just a comfortable place. So to notice, so what we're worrying about is how these things are imported, successfully or unsuccessfully, into the open world of learning. So again, asking of this world, to what extent is that comfortable disposition reproduced, but to what extent does the loss of structure that study normally seems to require To what extent is the loss of structure, the informality, maybe drawing in forms of tension that are incompatible with what you're trying to do? I hope that makes some kind of sense. So it's this kind of comparison in the following slides. I'm giving you a kind of template for looking at the following slides, in which I use the student's voice as it came through in conversations about these matters as illustration of different forms of tension that get imported when you try and migrate an informality of the social world into the formality of deliberate private study. So here are some examples. So we have a phenomenon in England which is captured in the phrase neighbours from hell, and tabloid newspapers are fond of finding examples where some hapless family has found themselves next to another kind of family that make their life, a social life, kind of deeply uncomfortable. And this is reproduced to some extent in libraries, not in the exaggerated way I've portrayed it here, but they offer you a kind of license to be really quite recreational with some of these technologies. So you can be playing games on these massive, great screens, and you can be making quite a lot of noise. And of course, the social world is like that. It does come with forms of social interaction that are obstructive to your social life and are a kind of hellish neighborhood. Here's another kind of British phenomenon, I think, in which someone's enthusiasm for their garden has got out of control, and this has a kind of version within the library where people territorially claim acres of desk space and impose their personality upon it to an extent that obstructs other people making creative use of the environment. So here's some people talking about this. Basically it's about coming in at night, shoving your stuff down, and basically, claiming it as yours. And those quotes speak for themselves, I think. Here's another kind of phenomenon that is a sort of version of that, in which people take innocent, the example here I think is covered in the second quote, basically this girl using a big table with some guy, and I think it was, the small table was being used for a mouse. So it's basically a large mouse mat. And we didn't have any table, and we were like, well, can we use this one? And they were like, I don't think so. So it's this kind of appropriation of territory for these specialist guerrilla purposes. I couldn't find an easy way of summarizing this, but it's a recurrent and not surprising form of commentary that students make upon their experience lives. So I've used the great British tradition of binge drinking as my example, and here we are thinking, oh, just one more drink, and it's kind of like that. Let's just talk about last night a bit longer, or let's do something that isn't working because we've got down here and we're all friends and so on. And so the conversation flows along nicely, and of course it's obstructive to what they're trying to do, and students were very vigorous in reminding us that this was on the other hand, and this is very important to say, I think, students would be very willing to admit that what they took 5 hours to do in this space could have been done in 1 hour if they'd gone to the floors above where all these informalities were not permitted. But on the other hand, many of them would say, I just wouldn't do any working if I couldn't come here. So there's clearly a sense in which this design is opening up opportunities for some students, but it's also a difficult kind of regime to manage. And it's difficult because you cannot simply unproblematically import social structures from the comfortable Starbucks world of the rest of our life into spaces which are designed for this rather particular activity of conscious, deliberate study. And I think the belief that you can do this painlessly or without deep consideration of design is another species of that recurrent modern belief, and here I really do tread on dangerously conservative space, of that learning must be fun, that it's inevitably and relentlessly needing to be a fun experience. Well, working life is not so simple. I think preparing this presentation was not fun Now, I may find that I'm sure I will find I'm very rewarded by the opportunity it's given me to articulate my thinking, and there may be a tiny reward from your kind smiles at the end. So it's worth doing, but the act of doing it is quite demanding, and many things in our working life are demanding, and it's irresponsible of educational practice to fail to prepare young people for a world in which they can expect reward, but in which gaining that reward may necessarily require a form of discipline and unfun-like activity. So we have to be careful when we aspire towards these architectural solutions to empowering and animating the experience of study. Well, let me summarize the points I've made. I need now to read this. I think what I want to say is the social turn is very much with us, and it's very welcome, but it does mean something that takes us beyond, if we want to apply it seriously within the world of higher education, or indeed any sector of education, beyond a narrow conception of collaborative learning. And I think we need to notice within our institutional context of education that the social experience of learning has been reconfigured under the influence of new tools and new designs for mediating the communication opportunities that take place within those spaces. And often those tools can create forms of interpersonal distance that I think, although we don't always articulate them as individual participants, nevertheless they're not always welcome, and we are implicitly, if not explicitly, sensitive to a disturbance of an interpersonal quality that can arise within these various contexts of educational practice. So, for example, yes, the lecture is a kind of dialogue, and various technologies we lob into it can disrupt that experience. Assessment is a form of relationship between people, and technologies can disturb the quality of that relationship. The curriculum does have a voice, and I think it gains meaning and significance and perspective for us when that voice is clearly exercised and identified. Collaboration is something that's animated by resources. We collaborate around things, and the nature of those resources will shape the quality of experience that is derived from that collaborative talk. Finally, as in my example, social practice, a larger configuration of our social experience needs to be designed, but when we aspire to import the convivial experience of social practice into the demanding conditions of deliberate learning, then we do so, I think, with care. I don't say we shouldn't aspire to do that. I think it's an important interface that needs to be understood, but it's not an easy one. Well, thank you for your attention, and if you have a small mobile device with a camera and you wish to have a copy of this PowerPoint, then now's your opportunity to get one.